They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine was served at room temperature with a smile and a long-term plan that took years to execute. The day Elaine stood at my wedding altar and announced to 200 guests that I wasn't good enough for her son, she thought she was ending my story. What she actually did was hand me the blueprint for dismantling her carefully constructed empire of control. I'm about to tell you exactly how a quiet garden designer who once couldn't even look in mirrors became the woman who methodically stripped a narcissistic mother-in-law of every ounce of power she thought owned. Let me tell you how. My name is Lydia. Before Elaine, my life was quiet, not perfect, not effortless, but quiet. I spent my days surrounded by sketches and soil, building gardens for people who had forgotten how to breathe. That's what design gave me: structure, solace. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up after nearly losing it to an eating disorder in my 20s. Back then, I had no language for what my father's voice had done to me. I only knew I hated mirrors, and I feared silence, and I measured my worth in calories. Years of therapy didn't erase the past, but they taught me how to live beside it. By the time I met Matthew, I had become a woman I respected. Careful, steady, not someone who fell easily or quickly. But he had this quiet way of listening without trying to fix, without filling the room with words. I felt seen in a way that didn't ask for performance. We were engaged 9 months later. It felt sudden but right. The proposal was simple, just us, in a botanical conservatory I had helped design. He knelt beside a fountain and told me he didn't want to spend another year without waking up next to me. I said yes, and for a moment I believed the hardest parts of life were behind me. Then I met Elaine. She was polished like glass, sharp, elegant, hard to hold without cutting yourself. The first time we met, she smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. We sat at an over-decorated table in her sunroom, and within 10 minutes she had asked where my mother went to college, if I planned to keep working after the wedding, and whether I had ever considered chin surgery. It was all said lightly, with the tone of a woman making conversation, but I felt it, the temperature drop, the judgment behind her phrasing. The way she looked at me like an unpolished stone next to her collection of antique diamonds. Matthew didn't see it. Not then. He thought she was just being protective. He told me she had high standards, that she always warmed up eventually. I believed him. Or maybe I wanted to. Then came the planning. Elaine inserted herself into every detail. She hired a new florist without asking. She told the baker to reduce the cake tiers, said we didn't need anything excessive. She rewrote the guest list 3 times. And when I questioned the white silk gown, she ordered 2 sizes smaller than I wore, said smiling that a little motivation never hurt anyone. I swallowed my discomfort. I told myself she meant well, that families were complicated, that I was overreacting. But underneath that quiet, something inside me had already begun to watch. And the truth was, I had seen women like Elaine before. They do not change. They must be removed. It happened the night before the wedding. The rehearsal dinner was held at a vineyard Elaine had chosen, the kind of place with polished wood floors and antique chandeliers, every detail curated to reflect her taste, her wealth, her version of our story. I had stayed quiet for weeks, letting her orchestrate things with Matthew's blessing. I thought keeping the peace was a kind of strength. I thought silence would buy me grace. But that night, she decided silence wasn't enough. She wanted humiliation. It was during the toast. The room had fallen into that soft lull after the last course, before the music. Elaine stood with a glass of champagne and smiled like she was hosting a royal banquet. She started with Matthew, complimented his career, his discipline, his character. Then she turned to me. Her voice didn't change. Still light. Still polite. "You've come a long way, Lydia," she said, lifting her glass higher. "Some people might even forget where you started, but I'll admit I never expected someone with your history to wear white quite so confidently." There was no gasp, no outrage, just the sound of knives resting gently against plates, the kind of silence that swells before something breaks. She smiled wider. I suppose tradition means different things to different people. I stood, calmly, no tears, no words. Matthew didn't speak. He looked down, maybe at the napkin in his lap, or maybe at nothing at all. I didn't wait to find out. I left the table, walked through the arched glass doors, and stepped into the vineyard's cold night air. I could hear someone call my name behind me, maybe his sister, maybe a friend. I didn't turn back. That was the moment I stopped pretending, not just with Elaine, but with Matthew too. Because when someone wounds you in public and the person who loves you stays seated, you are no longer engaged to a man. You are tethered to a mirror. I stayed in a hotel that night. I told no one. The next morning, when I returned to the bridal suite, my mother's name was missing from the seating chart. Elaine had replaced the officiant with someone closer to the family. The dress had been pressed and laid out without my permission. And the chair my father was supposed to sit in, he was gone, but I had asked for one, and his memory had been removed. No note, no explanation, just absence. That's when I knew this wasn't about a dress or tradition. It was about control. It was about erasure. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection. Not to check my makeup, not to adjust my posture. I looked into my own eyes and whispered one word: enough. I didn't return to the rehearsal venue. I didn't reply to the dozen voicemails or the florist's frantic texts or Matthew's short, confused messages asking where I was. I let the noise pile up, then I silenced it. The morning after Elaine's toast, I called Carmen. We had met years ago, back when I was clawing my way out of the wreckage my father left behind. Carmen had been the one who helped me file a civil suit against him for the hospital bills he refused to cover. She was the first woman who ever looked at me and said, "You are not what they did to you." So when she picked up the phone and I said only I need a paper trail followed, she didn't ask why. She said, "Where do we start?" In the days that followed, I learned what Elaine had been doing behind her pearls and place settings. She had rewritten portions of Matthew's family trust 3 years earlier, moving large chunks of liquid capital into a holding company in her name. She had begun restructuring board positions within the Mercer Foundation, placing herself as executive head and quietly removing Matthew's voting rights. The Mercer family estate, what Matthew once promised would one day be our home, was listed as collateral on a failing commercial property she had invested in out of state. It was more than sabotage, it was theft. And it had been planned long before I came into the picture. My presence was just the threat that sharpened her knives. I asked Carmen to go deeper, financial forensics, not to bring charges, not yet. I needed truth. I needed leverage. While she dug through the ledgers, I studied faces. I watched Matthew closely. I tested his silences, his discomfort around confrontation. The way he still spoke about Elaine like she was more myth than mother. I saw the parts of him that wanted peace so badly he was willing to live in a lie to get it. So I said nothing. I made no accusations. Instead, I booked a second venue. A private estate 2 hours outside the city. Smaller, quieter, no chapel, just trees and a low stone wall covered in ivy. I asked Carmen to officiate, legally certified and quietly binding. I contacted the registrar and changed the date on the marriage license to match the private event. I made no announcement. I let the original wedding march forward like a train headed off a cliff. No one, not Elaine, not Matthew, not the dozens of guests watching my movements like theater, knew that the real wedding would take place on my terms. In silence, in secrecy, in power. It was easier than I thought it would be. People like Elaine are so consumed with the performance of control that they rarely notice when you start writing a second script beneath their lines. While she fine-tuned the floral centerpieces and rehearsed her reading for the chapel ceremony, I worked in silence, laying the groundwork for a different kind of ending. The venue I chose was a private garden estate nestled between two hills, owned by a family friend of Carmen's. It had no pews, no podiums, just a circle of sycamores and a single arch of twisted metal vines. There would be no guests, no photographers, no family heirlooms passed from hand to hand, just vows, just truth. I told Matthew the truth 48 hours before that day. We sat in his apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes and two untouched suit jackets still in plastic. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened the folder Carmen had compiled and placed it in front of him. The documents were unambiguous: his mother's signatures, the hidden accounts, the deed transfers, the forged minutes from family board meetings that never happened. The evidence was layered, deliberate, and damning. He read it all without speaking. At one point, he stood and walked to the window, facing away. His shoulders didn't shake, but I knew something in him was splintering. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I trusted her. I didn't reply. Trust is not a virtue when it defends the wrong people. Then I handed him the new trust forms. Legally sound, restoring his rights, naming us as joint holders of all properties associated with the Mercer Foundation, reassigning his inheritance away from her shell companies. Carmen had written a letter, a legal declaration, signed and notarized, stating that our union, this second private ceremony, would now govern the distribution of legacy assets. He didn't ask me to stop. He didn't beg for time. He signed. I watched him as he wrote his name, the curve of his hand, the tremor in his jaw. And in that moment, I saw a man beginning to let go of the version of his mother he had protected his entire life. That night, I delivered two things to Elaine's house. The first was the original dress she had ordered me, folded neatly in a garment bag, along with a note that read, "Thank you for the loan." The second was a sealed envelope with a copy of the newly reassigned board structure. No explanation, no flourish, just the beginning of her erasure. She wouldn't open it right away. Of course not. She would assume it was a thank you card, a gesture of compliance. She would smile. She would believe she had won. And that was exactly what I needed her to think. The original ceremony began at noon on a cloudless Saturday. Elaine arrived in a navy silk gown, one hand looped through the arm of a distant cousin she had elevated to the role of escort. Her smile was tight, triumphant. The photographers captured her from every angle. She posed beneath the rose arch she had chosen herself, flanked by 2 rows of imported lilies. Everything was staged exactly as she wanted it. Everything except the bride. I was not there. The guests waited, whispered, checked their programs. Some glanced at Matthew, who stood at the altar in the suit she had picked. He was pale, still, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, not from nerves, but from knowing. At 12:15, Carmen walked in. She did not wear a gown. She wore a black tailored suit with silver thread at the cuffs. In her hands, she carried a folder. Elaine's smile faltered. Carmen stepped up to the altar, ignored the microphone, and raised her voice just enough to still the crowd. Then she opened the folder. The first thing she read was the legal declaration. In clear, unwavering terms, she laid out the facts: that the original ceremony was now a symbolic gathering only, that the legal marriage had already taken place in accordance with revised estate and trust agreements, and that any objections to this restructuring would be considered fraudulent attempts to interfere with legally binding property rights. Gasps echoed through the courtyard. Carmen continued. She read aloud excerpts from emails, messages between Elaine and her financial advisor detailing the concealed transfers of family funds. She projected documents onto the ceremony's white backdrop using a portable projector she had carried in with her briefcase. One by one, the illusions began to collapse. Elaine tried to interrupt. She stepped forward and hissed something about privacy, about slander, about lawyers. Carmen didn't flinch. "I am the lawyer," she said, turning her gaze on her like a floodlight. "And this is not slander. This is your signature." Then, from the back of the crowd, I walked in. I wasn't wearing white. I wore silver. Sleek, unadorned. The same tone as the sky over the private garden where I had said my vows 2 days earlier. The guests turned. Elaine froze. Matthew stepped down from the altar and met me halfway. He didn't ask questions. He took my hand. Then he turned to the crowd and spoke not loudly but with absolute clarity. "My wife and I were married on Thursday. This ceremony is no longer valid. There have been changes to the family structure and to the Mercer Foundation. You'll receive an official statement within the week." Silence wrapped the space like plastic. Elaine stood at the center of it, perfectly still, the wind tugging gently at her gown. There were no screams, no shouts, just the soft rustling of programs as guests began to leave. No one helped her down from the altar. No one spoke her name. She had dressed for power, but she was no longer the matriarch. She had been replaced. The fallout came quietly, which is how real consequences tend to arrive. Not with fire, but with distance, with silence, with absence where presence once ruled. Elaine did not respond to the initial legal filings. Her attorney issued a bland statement about miscommunication and clerical confusion, but the documentation Carmen submitted was airtight. There were no loopholes to crawl through. The revised trust structure, the reallocation of board seats, the transfer of assets, all were completed, signed, and witnessed, all entirely legal. Within a month, Elaine was removed from her role as executive director of the Mercer Foundation. No announcement was made. Her name was taken off the masthead without ceremony. The gala invitation still went out, but her seat was reassigned to the far end of the table. She didn't fight back publicly. She couldn't. To challenge the decisions meant dragging her own fraud into light, and Elaine cared more about her image than her control. She always had. Socially, the shift was subtle. The phone rang less. Invitations slowed. Her closest allies retreated, careful not to be pulled into scandal. No one likes to sit too close to a collapsing empire. Matthew changed too, not immediately, but slowly, visibly. He apologized without excuse, not just once, but often. Not with flowers, but with effort. Therapy sessions, long walks where he listened more than he spoke. He began to acknowledge the shape of his mother's manipulation, how it had wrapped around his entire identity since he was a boy. There was grief in that, and guilt, but also a strange kind of freedom. Our relationship didn't return to what it had been. It evolved, gained weight in the right places, a kind of gravity built from truth. We kept the private ceremony a secret from most. Only a few close friends knew. There was no need to rewrite the past publicly. The point wasn't spectacle. The point was sovereignty. Elaine sent 2 letters in the months that followed. The first arrived on thick linen stationery with no return address. Inside was a single line, "I hope you're satisfied." I didn't open the second. I burned it in the garden fire pit without reading the contents. Carmen and I met once a week during that time, mostly to finalize paperwork, but also to sit in silence with someone who had seen the whole thing, who never flinched. She told me once that women like Elaine don't expect to be removed. They expect resistance, tears, a scene. What unsettled them most is not being fought. It is being replaced. Late in the fall, I returned to the estate Elaine had once tried to fold into her failing development plan. After the restructuring, it became part of our shared holdings. Matthew offered to sell it, said we could cut ties with the entire property, but I didn't want that. There is a certain kind of power in reclamation, in choosing to stay, not because you're stuck, but because you know what it means to make something bloom where something once withered. The house was still in good shape, cold, unlived in, but structurally sound. The garden had gone wild, vines creeping over stone, dry earth waiting. I walked the grounds with my boots crunching across gravel, my breath visible in the chill. Carmen had offered to help convert the land into a nonprofit retreat, a space for women who needed quiet. Women like me, once, women who had been told they were too much or not enough. I agreed. We kept the structure minimal. No mirrors, no scales, no portraits of benefactors in heavy gold frames, just windows, just breath, just room. I spent hours designing the courtyard, not elaborate, just clean paths, soft lines, a bench tucked beneath the trees. And in the center, I planted roses. Elaine hated roses, said they were too fussy, too symbolic. I chose white ones. Then, at the last moment, added a single line of crimson threading through the middle, not for her, for me. Every morning since, I've come out to water them. Hands in the soil, Sunday on my face, the silver bracelet on my wrist catching the light as I reach down and touch what's real. I never needed Elaine's approval. I never needed her son's protection. What I needed was mine, my voice, my name, my ground, and now I have it. As I knelt near the base of the first bush, brushing away a few scattered leaves, I saw the first rose opening, quiet, defiant, unapologetic in its bloom. And I heard her voice in my memory, clear as glass. "You're too fat to marry my son." I smiled and whispered into the dirt, soft and sure, "You were never the one I needed to marry. I was always going to belong here. And now I do."